Coming up next on the Wet Fly Swing podcast.
You start basically tying it backwards. You wind the first hackle of marabou, at the back, what would look like the back, and then you flip the tube around so it's the front. But what it does is, it just really helps it to stay upright and creates a lot more bulk in the water. So that's the biggest advantage of it. And it really creates a lot of movement too, because it doesn't mat down. So it really allows the fingers and the fibers of the marabou to work real well in the water.
That was Rick Kustich with the reverse fly tying tip, Spey Nation, how to set the hook, and the Steelhead School today on The Swing.
Welcome to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show, where you discover tips, tricks, and tools from the leading names in fly fishing today.
Hey, how are you doing today? Thanks for stopping by the show. One of the best ways to support this podcast is to check in with our sponsors. You can go to any of their websites and click over there right now and have a look and see what you need next to fill that gear satchel right now. Before we get started today with Rick, I'd like to remind you that we have a big giveaway that just launched. This is for the Steelhead Alley trip, and this year we're giving away a trip with Rick and or Geoff Schaake, so we got a double deal going this year. You can head over to wetflyswing.com/giveaway right now and enter to win this giveaway. This is the best chance for you to get not only a trip to Steelhead Alley with either Rick, Geoff Schaake, and I, and the gear. We got a bunch of great gear as well. So again, that's wetflyswing.com/giveaway. Enter there, enter your email, name will follow up with the winner. We're going to be announcing this live on Facebook next week. So stay tuned for that. If you want to actually get a slot and get a paid slot right now, you can also go to wetflyswing.com/steelhead school, and that'll give you a chance to enter your name there as well. And we can give you more information about how to get one of those paid slots. We got a limited number this year. We've got some people returning, so if you're interested, definitely sign up for that. And if you win the trip, if you win the giveaway, we will refund your money. So there's two ways to jump into this. All right, excited to get going with Rick. Let's see what we have here. Today's episode is sponsored by Eastern Idaho's Yellowstone Teton Territory, Idaho's most renowned zone for fly fishing, from the Henry's Fork to the South Fork of the Snake and all the high alpine lakes and streams in between. Yellowstone Teton Territory provides anglers and other outdoor enthusiasts with all the information they need to plan their next big trip. You can visit wetflyswing.com/Teton right now to get the full list of outfitters, lodges, fly shops, and all kinds of inspiration to get you started on your next trip to Eastern Idaho. That's Teton, Teton, wetflyswing.com/Teton. An amazing resource for fly tying materials, tools, and fishing accessories. Since 2005, Togans has been over-delivering on price, service, and passion. And now you can check out that Togans buzz for yourself. Right now, you can head over to wetflyswing.com/Togans to get started. That's TOGENS. You support this podcast by clicking through that link to Togans Online. Rick Kustich is back on the podcast today to take us into Modern Spey and some of his new things he has going, including a new book. We discover who some of the early players were in the Spey game. We get a little more history there. We find out how Rick swings flies on Lake Erie tribs, and we're going to dig deep into Steelhead Alley because Rick is going to be our guide this year, along with his crew, some other people you know of. So this is going to be exciting. Steelhead Alley, if you want to get into it and check it out, we got Rick, and we're going to dig into it right now. Here we go. Rick Kustich from rickkustich.com. How's it going, Rick?
Great, Dave. Great to be here again. Always enjoy talking with you.
Yeah, thanks for coming back on here. I'll put a link in the show notes to the last episode we did. It always seems like when I have these repeat episodes, like it's been years and years. I'm sure it hasn't been that long, but I wanted to get an update since the last time we talked. You've got a new book that's out on steelhead, and steelhead is always a hot topic. We're actually going to be fishing with you this year, which is exciting. We're heading out to not only Ohio, but New York this year to fish with you and Nick. And so this is going to be a big year. I feel like New York has been a hot topic for me because we've been doing a lot of trout. Obviously, it's got steelhead. Maybe let's start. We're going to get the update in a second, but just talk about New York from a steelhead perspective. Like, how is it different than, say, anywhere else in the Great Lakes?
I think, first of all, it's quite diverse in terms of the size of the rivers and the opportunities. I mean, from, big water, like even though the lower Niagara River, which is, 200,000 CFS, to some smaller intimate streams. So I think there's just a wide variety of water. So I think that's one thing New York offers. And I think the other thing is it's just so condition oriented. So the conditions just change from day to day. It can really be a frustration from a fishing standpoint, but and provide some challenge. But it certainly also can provide that great satisfaction when you can kind of put all the pieces together and hit it just right. It just seems like there's always something that's probably fishing well, based on sometimes some water's high and some water's low, and some clear, some dirty, and it's really just kind of a matter of putting the pieces together every day. I think that's what kind of makes our fishery somewhat unique.
That's it. So any given day, you've kind of know I guess that's why, being a guide and knowing everybody around there, you kind of know what's going on. This river's out, this river's in, you're talking. I think Geoff mentioned that when we were in Ohio. That's a big part of what you guys offer from the guide's perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Just being able to try to stay one step ahead of it and, anticipate, what weather conditions are going to do to the river conditions, and, just try to stay that one step ahead. I mean, it's not always, it's certainly not foolproof, but we give it our best, and most of the time it works out.
That's right. Nice. And what is just on the head, so we don't forget this, the new book, talk about the new book. What's the name, and talk about why you did another book, because you've got a number of books now.
Yeah, so the new book is titled Modern Spey Fishing. And what I tried to accomplish there is to, I guess, demystify spey fishing a bit. And it's more than just a steelhead book. It's more than just really even an anadromous fish book. It really tries to cover all that spey has to offer, including talking about trout spey, and even how you can apply it to smallmouth fishing, and a variety of other species, and how you can apply two-handed, even two-handed overhead casting into your fly fishing. So it's really is aimed at looking at the full approach of where spey has come to, and how angler. I do think there's increased just in general fly fishermen in spey, and even if it's just more an inquisitive portion at this point, but I think that more and more anglers are finding ways that they can incorporate it into their fishing. So that's really what this is aimed at, trying to provide the information for people to take it to another level and enjoy it at a different level.
Nice. And would this be for somebody, if they're listening now and they've been thinking about getting into spey, don't really have a rod or anything, would this be good for them, the beginner?
Yeah, absolutely. I tried to create a book that would be very helpful for someone that has never spey fished before, to try to break down the terminology, in terms of rods and lines, and, match what their objectives would be in terms of spey fishing, but also try to incorporate more detailed information on particularly the fishing aspect of spey fishing, the tactical aspect, and a couple of strong chapters, I think, on presenting the fly and how it can go just beyond simply casting and swinging a fly to really, actively fishing a fly on a tight line, in different types of water that maybe, wasn't originally associated with spey casting and spey fishing and swinging a fly.
Nice. Well, I wanted to talk, in your book, you don't cover, it's not just steelhead, but today I think I want to focus a little bit back on steelhead, because we are going to be heading out there this year and later in December. Well, it's early December. I think we're going to be heading out there. We don't have the exact details yet, but essentially this year we're going to be kind of doing two trips. We did the Steelhead Alley trip where we were out with Geoff Schaake, and we hit that in Ohio, and we actually had a little bit of PA as well, but now we're going to be having this kind of the second part is New York. And so I want to talk about that a little bit today, what people can expect. So talk about that. So if we had this trip we're planning now for, early December, what does that look like? Are the rivers we're going to be fishing, are these some secret waters? Are these waters everybody knows about? What's that going to look like?
Well, I think at that time of year, we start to transition from, that fall fishing, and we can already start to receive a little early winter weather in December. So what I do like about that is, what New York has is mainly winter run fish. So the fish continue to enter into the rivers well in late November, early December. Actually, December is really one of my favorite months for fishing steelhead. I mean, the water gets a little colder, maybe the fish aren't quite as aggressive as they would be in October and November, but they'll take a swung fly still very well at that time of year. So, conditions, as I mentioned earlier, conditions are the key to this fishery. And, they probably become just a touch more challenging as you get into December, given the fact that you can start to get into some colder water situations or even a bit of freezing. So, in terms of the water we'd be fishing, it's really good to range from some bigger water. The one thing that New York offers over Ohio is that we do have access to tributaries on Lake Ontario as well as Lake Erie. So it's not all just the steelhead, traditional Steelhead Alley waters. We would prefer, I think, generally I prefer fishing the Lake Erie, tributaries if possible. Part of that is that, the runs have been fairly solid, on our Lake Erie tributaries. We do have some wild fish production on those tributaries as well. So, I prefer that. If everything goes well, we would probably focus on the Cattaraugus and, certainly a premier river in the Great Lakes region, some beautiful water or countryside that it runs through, some deep gorges, things of that nature, and perfect for swinging a fly. So that would be our first choice if, the conditions all work out well.
Yep. Perfect. That's awesome. And that's definitely a name I've heard a lot about. So that would be fun to do. And it seemed like when we did the Ohio trip, the thing that blew me away was just, kind of the diversity and how cool it was. I mean, there were people out there, but there was diversity of river sizes and then the techniques, right? And then when you got into the, Geoff had it so dialed in on things, is that kind of the same thing with you guys, like the lines? I guess let's talk about that when we're talking about Modern Spey. So what does that look like for you when we're out there? Are we going to be using a mix of lines, sinking lines, dry lines, rods, stuff like that?
Yeah, I think, for the most part at that time of year, we'll be fishing the fly down in the water column. So, it'd probably be a mostly Skagit, style lines at that time, probably sinking leaders, maybe even if the water's up high, some 10-foot pieces of T8 and T11, things of that nature. But a lot of times we just use like sinking poly leaders, Versi leaders, things of that nature, in the 5 to 7 inch per second range. And then try to control also depth with weighted or unweighted flies and angle of cast and things of that nature. But, for the most part, we'll be fishing water that'll be, on the colder end, and we'll be fishing the fly down in the water column. Both Nick and I like using shorter rods, kind of give a little more intimate connection to the fish. I think that, in the last number of years, just a lot of rod manufacturers are making some quality rods in that, 11 to 12 and a half foot range. So I think that matches up well with the rivers that we'll be fishing.
Perfect. Great. And Nick, we'll put a link to that episode we had with Nick Pionessa a while back as well in the show notes. And so we're starting to tick off some of those names out there, some of those Great Lakes. Who else is out there that you're kind of connecting with? Are there other guides that you're talking with out there quite a bit on Steelhead Alley stuff?
Well, sure. One that I work with is Vince Tobia. He owns, a business called Cattaraugus Creek Outfitters. Pretty extensive, successful guide and travel business. And Vince is a good guy. And, both Nick and I work with him to some degree as well as having our own clients. Has been doing it for a number of years. And, if I still have to talk to him, but he would possibly be the third guide we'd have on that trip.
Yeah. The trip will be later or in December, but we're going to be launching this giveaway event, which is going to be fun. We do every year. And so we're going to be talking about that and putting that together. So we did have a couple questions. I'm going to take a little break here, Rick. We have this new segment we're doing on Instagram where we're doing like a Q&A. And we did a little bit of a shout out to you coming on the podcast. And we have a few people who asked some questions. And I just want to give a shout out to them because these are questions I already asked one of them. But here's one from JMOCE Gyee. I'm not quite sure on who that is exactly, but on Instagram, he asked, what is the ideal water temperature for swinging for steelhead, which is always a good question.
Yeah, I think ideally, if you can find water temperatures that are between 44 and 56, I think that's when fish are the most active. But I think really a lot of it has to do with just the direction of the temperature as well. It's not always just absolute temperature, but if you have more stable temperatures, where you don't have any dramatic drops in the temperature overnight, I think that keeps fish more active. I've seen even, within that optimum range, if you in our rivers are susceptible to some dramatic decreases in water temperature overnight if you get a cold snap. There is some groundwater influence, but not a lot, so that the air temperature can really have a significant impact. So when you get a dramatic decrease overnight, it can really slow the fish's metabolism down. So you'll notice that in the morning. So a lot of times, even in those situations, I'd even try to delay going out a little bit until things have a chance to start warming up a little bit and recovering. And even, when water temperatures drop below 42 or even into the 30s, fish will still be pretty active to a swinging fly, especially after the water stabilized. If it stabilizes and if it drops from 45 down to 35 or something like that in a real short period of time, that can really slow, the fish's activity. But once it's dropped into that, high 30, mid 30 range and has kind of stabilized in that, it seems like, the fish adapt to that and can still remain pretty active and chase a fly pretty well. We'll just try to adjust the water we're fishing so that, the fly isn't swinging quite as fast in those colder flows. I'm trying to find, some of the slower, deeper pools and things of that nature and try to adjust to that way. But still, we still get very aggressive takes even in that cold water. And, it took me even a while to use to that. When I was first starting out, you'd hear the stories, first, in the Great Lakes, they don't take a swinging fly
Right.
at all. That was one of the, great false bits of information I heard when I was fishing. But, just even the whole idea of them taking a Great Lakes steelhead taking a swinging fly in cold water, that has definitely changed. And, you really just, it really helps when you have stabilized cold water though.
Yeah, stabilize. That's key. No, it's a great tip. So if it's cold, and what were the temperatures again? You mentioned the range where they're most active.
I feel the most optimum range is between 42 and 56.
Yeah, 56. Yeah, that's right. Okay. No, that was a great clarification. And then on the history, that. So take us back there for a second. I can't remember if we talked about this on the last episode we did, but what was that like? Give us a little snippet. When was it when people were saying, man, nobody's swinging flies, you can't do it? When was that? And then what did it look like as that changed?
Well, I'd even go back to, so I've been fishing for steelhead in the Great Lakes since 75, I believe. And back then it was, you couldn't even catch them on flies. It didn't matter, not even dead drifting. So that's where we started, to kind of prove that wrong. And, then it just, I think by the early to mid 80s, we were swinging flies for them and, clearly proved that you could do that. And then, throughout that time, through the 80s and early 90s, proved you can do it in cold water, and it just kind of continued to escalate from there.
Yeah, it keeps going. And then what's the next step? Because it seems like we're all on this path, right? As you get, maybe, I don't know, you get bored of however that works. You keep making it harder. Like what's the next step after this? Like in Modern Spey, do you talk about that at all?
Yeah, well, I guess the next step is really just kind of catching fish on your own, totally on your own terms. And I guess that next thing would be just, using more floating lines and, fishing the fly higher in the water column and things of that nature. And that all works. You just have to find the right conditions and the right situations. So that's probably the last front, or the next frontier anyways.
That's awesome. We have a couple of West Coasters who I'm sure you know of, and Adrian Cortez is one where they're just, doing winter. We'll put some links out to these episodes as well. But yeah, it's all winter, all dry on the surface. And the thing about that is you're just not going to get as many hits, but they definitely get some And just remind me that you guys are having an event. Maybe we could talk about this. I'm not sure. I think that it's in August this year, but talk about this Spey event that's coming out into your neck of the woods.
Yeah, so August 11th to August 13th, Spey Nation. So Spey Nation was a spey clave, a 1-day spey clave that was in existence. The driving force was an individual named Geoff Schaake, and it was in the past was an event that raised some money for a landlocked salmon restoration project in New York State. COVID kind of interrupted the original Spey Nation, and it hasn't been held the last few years because of that. And so Swing the Fly, Zach Williams at Swing the Fly picked up the Spey Nation name and this past year, and we're bringing it back as a 3-day event. So last year, Topher Brown and I had under the Swing the Fly banner hosted some spey casting classes on the Salmon River in August, and they were very successful. So we combined those classes this year with the original kind of format of the Spey Nation, which is just really a spey clave open to the public. So what we ended up with is going to be a Saturday event, and I guess that's August 12th, where there'll just be a lineup of presenters providing a variety of topics on spey. And then on the Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, we're going to have classes. So it'll be fishing classes, casting classes, tying classes that require a fee and pre-registration. And combining it all together and having a Friday kind of an informal happy hour event as well to kind of mingle with the presenters and things of that nature. So I'm really excited about it. I think it's going to be a great event, and seems to have a lot of energy behind it right now. So yeah, should be good.
That's cool. Yeah, I love that. Was Zach or I'm trying to think, the Swing the Fly, was he from originally the Great Lakes area and then headed out west?
Zach is originally from Michigan. Yes.
There you go. Which is, not that uncommon. It feels like there's a lot of people that were out there headed west and maybe headed back eventually. But there's a lot of overlap. I remember when Geoff talked about that when we were doing our thing, he kind of made it sound like, hey, there's not a lot of people doing the west heading out to the Great Lakes. But it seems like maybe that's kind of even going behind us too, because it's all the same thing, really. It's just fishing.
Yeah. I love that. My brother Jerry and I used to talk about that all the time. There seemed to be such a division between, West Coast steelhead and what people were doing in the Great Lakes. And I do really like that that's broken down a bit, that, we have a legitimate fishery here, and, you can call them what you want. I mean, whether they're, freshwater steelhead or, to me, they're still migratory fish. And, it's a fishery worth people's time and effort. And I do like that seems like that's that division is broken down a bit, and it's just fishing, like you said.
Yeah, it's just fishing. Cool. Well, let's do another little Instagram Q&A, and remind us again. Go ahead.
Just real quick, Dave. If people want to know more about the Spey Nation event, on the Swing the Fly website, if you go to the website, there's a Spey Nation button there, and has all the details. And if anybody wants to register for a class, it has the schedule of the presenters, and we're really trying to provide like a full day. I think it's the an opportunity to kind of get this thing re-energized and have well thought out presentations that kind of connect to one another, so that if somebody's new to spey, they would get something out of it. If somebody is in that intermediate phase, they'd get something out of it as well, and good access to all the presenters. So I think that's really what this is going to offer.
Perfect. No, this is awesome. I think this is the perfect fit too for what we have going, because people can hit that in August, maybe get a class, get ready, and then still land on our trip in December where they're ready to really go deep on the, the deep dive even deeper. So absolutely.
And one of the greatest, things that we there's a number of people that took classes last year that are going to take other classes this year. So it's really, working out to be a way for people to, really continue to improve their skills.
Perfect. No, this is awesome. I love it. Remind us again on Instagram. What's your handle on Instagram?
It's just at Rick Kustich.
Okay, perfect. And we are obviously at Wet Fly Swing, so we will have people can follow us, and if they want to answer or ask a question for an upcoming guest. So we did this here this last week, and we got another question here from Cole.Pancake, and he asked, this is a good one because this could happen to us, right, while we're out there with the low water. He said, how do you catch a fish on the fly in low, clear water?
So there's no question that we have found that going stealthier certainly works best when that water gets clear and low. I mean, I do feel like, as much as I don't think sink tips and sinking leaders do much to spook fish when the water's up or when the water's got some stain, I feel totally different when the water's real low and clear. I think one of our best strategic move that we generally make in those situations is to just go to a long, monofilament or fluorocarbon leader and use a weighted fly, and just try to get that fly a lot further away from the fly line.
Gotcha. And how does that look when I guess you still have the Skagit head on there, you're still able to swing that fly?
Yeah, you could, or then you could cast that with a Scandi head if you'd like, or some type of a hybrid head.
Yeah, gotcha. And so with the modern, thinking again back to the book with Modern Spey, is it all swinging, or do you talk about other techniques you could use Spey for?
Well, I would say it's all tight line, and I would definitely this question I know it is addressed, in detail in the book, because there's I think two main advantages of being able to use a long monofilament leader or long fluorocarbon leader. And usually those leader lengths are going to be about the same length as your rod, that allows for the best in casting setup. But I do talk about that in there. This is and it really is the type of stuff that are covered extensively in a couple of the chapters. But so it's more about presentation of the fly on a tight line, and a lot of it is, yes, you're swinging the fly, but also how you can deal with different types of structure, how you deal with different types of water conditions, in the situation, weather, water conditions. And, the two things that I see with using the long leader like this, one is it's definitely stealthier. It's proven to be, much more effective when you get that really low, clear water. But it also, the lower diameter of the leader allows you to get a little slower swing as well. You can kind of control that swing path a little bit better. You don't get that same push of the current.
Right. It's almost like Euro nymphing. It's kind of like Euro nymphing, right?
Yeah, to a degree. I mean,
it's not like Euro nymphing, but it's the same concept.
Yeah, to a degree. You can slow the swing down, and so that also makes it effective in colder water too, where you really want to kind of make sure that fly is kind of just hanging, not moving real fast out of the lie, kind of hanging down in the current a little bit more. Because again, the lower diameter just doesn't get, the current isn't pushing it like it's pushing, the head of the line. And that's where using a Scandi head in combination with the long leader allows you to get a little better control on the speed, because you don't have that larger diameter of the head getting pushed by the current.
Right. Are you actually on these low clear? Are you seeing the fly, seeing the fish sort of thing?
Most of the time it's not. I won't say there. On some of the smaller rivers, there are opportunities where you'll actually see the fish and you'll actually see it react. But it's not that common. Even in the lower clear water, the fish are usually down, in crevices, cracks, behind rocks and things like that, where you're not going to actually. But it is a little more common to actually see like the flash of the fish or the movement of the fish, just as it takes the fly, and that's really exciting.
Let's take a quick break for a word from our sponsor. Waters West Fly Fishing Outfitters is your go-to resource for spey and swung fly techniques for the OP and beyond. They are known for their deep selection of unique, high-quality fly tie materials, and they are the gateway to some of the great steelhead rivers in the country. I was able to get out on the water with Ed, and it was an amazing day. We hit the shop early, met him at the shop. We fired up the old vehicle and headed out on the river. Ed is the type of guy that you feel comfortable right from minute one, and it was a good day. We ended the trip 4-buying into this unimproved boat ramp, pulling the boat out, and then we ended up with a great opportunity and landed a nice, very nice chromer and had a few other touches. Fished one of the great rivers in the country. It was amazing. Not only do they cover steelhead, but all species in the area, and they have a passion for all fish that swim up or live around salt. They can outfit any angler from the beginner to the most hardcore fishing bum you can imagine. They have a great online store, fast shipping, and you will be supporting conservation when you support Waters Last. Please check in with Ed and Kyle right now to say hi and let them know you heard from them on this podcast. And you can do that right now, wetflyswing.com/waterswest. So awesome. So we're hitting on a couple of these Instagram questions. I'm glad we did this because this is a new segment we're doing. I think people are loving it as we go. I've got another one I'm going to leave till the end, which is from somebody I think you know. But let's take it back to the trip. So break down the trip. So if we're going to be going, I know we're kind of creating it as we go, but I think essentially what we're doing is like a 4-night, 3 days, full days of on the water. What does that look like? What will people do? They come in there? Are we going to be, I guess coming in the night before? Talk about how you think the trip is going to look as we break it out over those days.
You arrive the night before and get rested up, get ready for a full, 3 full days.
Yeah. And I'm not even sure if we have, I'm trying to think of the place. I'm not sure if we've landed on a place yet, but will this be like a short drive, long drive potentially to the fishing waters, to the Cattaraugus or wherever?
Yeah, I think we will arrange something that will be probably a half-hour or so drive to where we would be fishing, in an ideal situation, and leaving the location in a place where we'll be able to hit other waters if the Cattaraugus doesn't work out. So kind of hedge the bets a little bit. And, at that time of year, fish are spread out throughout the river. We usually concentrate a little higher up on the water, on the river at that time of year. So, we'll have easy, half-hour access probably to that water, but we'll be able to make some changes and pivot if we need to.
Okay. And when we think of this, we always, we're thinking of this as like a school, more of a school, which talks about maybe digging in. And obviously you've got some books and lots of content there. How does that look from a school perspective? How does this look different than, say, just a guide trip from what we're doing?
I think any of my guide trips, and I know Nick is very similar, there's always an educational part of those trips. I mean, I never want to feel that anybody fishes with me that is just out there to simply catch fish. I want somebody to always leave with a lot more information in their head than they started the day with. So I think even my normal days out will, incorporate a lot of, educational opportunities. And so I see this being very similar, that we'll work hard to make sure that everybody has a really good understanding of what we're trying to accomplish and really go out there and give it some practical application.
Mm-hmm. And I think casting, the Spey is obviously always can be a challenge for people. We'll probably have a mix of backgrounds, people that are new and people that maybe don't need as much, but it seems like there's always something to tweak. Do you find that when you're guiding somebody out there?
Yeah,
there's always.
Yeah, always. And I mean, that even goes for myself when I'm fishing. I mean, there always seems like there's something to tweak or improve or change. I mean, I think the most fascinating thing about Spey casting and Spey fishing is the fact that it's always different. Every cast is different, depending on wind and current and depth and, and the water and the structure you're trying to cover. And it's just always a puzzle. Every cast, every step down is a new puzzle. So really trying, so even from my own standpoint, I mean, you're always kind of learning something. You're always trying to, figure out that puzzle. But at the same time, I think I try to work with people, as we work down a pool, just to point those things out and make everybody more aware. From an educational standpoint, sure, if someone is really new to it, we'll spend an hour or two just casting before we get out there, just so that it's less frustrating and, maybe even less dangerous, to make sure that you have that the basics. But then during the course of the day, I mean, once a individual has those basics down, you just kind of work throughout the day to continue to improve that and to continue to get more consistency. I really think that's really what it comes down to.
Perfect. Yeah, and I think we'll have to get something figured out too, where if we always try to have some coursework, but maybe what we'll do is just start with the book. Maybe we'll get everybody to walk away with one of your books, and we can talk about that as a piece to follow up on. I mean, I guess that's the question with your book. If somebody takes one of those home or is reading, is that a good prep for this trip?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's great prep for the trip. Again, it really an extensive chapter on rigging and extensive chapter on casting too. Really gives the basics. And from what I tried to do in that chapter too was not just talk about casting in detail, but also try to relate the casting to the fishing and how spey casting relates to the actual act of fishing, and how that you make different adjustments and different approaches to the casting throughout the day to meet the fishing challenges.
Right on. Perfect. And I think what I'm going to be doing on this is probably, because we're going to have a thing going in kind of Ohio as well, so I'll probably be in there and swing up. How far is it from, if you're fishing down lower, down some of the stuff Geoff fishes, to head up to your neck of the woods? What's that drive look like?
Oh, it's not far. Hour to an hour and a half.
Oh yeah, that's it. Right. So it's short. That's the thing you realize. Even though New York and they're all huge states, we're talking about a little area on the south shore of Lake Erie, right? So it's not that far apart.
Yeah, for the most part. It's a pretty extensive length of Lake Erie, but the areas that he fishes to, kind of that central Ohio up to the kind of the southern part of southwestern part of New York really isn't that far.
Gotcha. And you mentioned before on Ontario, so that would actually be a lot of fun to hit a new basin or new lake. So is it just a numbers thing where Lake Erie has more fish they're releasing, or why is Ontario, what's the difference there?
Well, this past year, definitely the runs on the Lake Ontario tributaries were better, stronger than the Lake Ontario tributaries. There's not as much water up there either. I think we have, the Lake Erie tributaries have a little more quality water, but probably the best opportunity that we would have in this western end of New York would be to look at the Niagara River. It's much different than the rivers we'd be fishing on Lake Erie, but it is it's unique, and I think really kind of provides a great experience, at least for a day. So that would be an option for sure.
Yeah, it's an option. That's the key, is have an option. So we're going to come in and, like we said, just walking through this trip, we're going to fish. Basically, we'll have probably about 6 people, 2 people with each guide. We'll go to maybe a different river. Maybe we'll be in the same river fishing it, and then we might mix it up each day, come back, maybe do a little fly tying at the end, depending on, where we're at. And then we'll have 3 solid full days on the river. And then the cool thing is that I think a lot of times people are driving because they're up in that area. And so I think there'll be opportunities that's kind of the cool thing about this, is that you learn from a guide, right? I think I've said that so many times. You want to increase, or however that is, decrease your learning curve, get a guide, and this is like kind of on steroids because we're doing like a full trip together of multiple days. So I feel like, when I came out of the one last year with Geoff, I had, a couple of huge things I was working on that I took away from that with my spey. Do you feel like that's kind of what it's about, finding a couple of really big things to work on over the year and then come back, or what's your take there?
Yeah, I think so. I look back on even how long I have been doing this, and and I see new casters and new anglers struggling with a certain thing, and I remember struggling with those same things many years ago. And it just does take time to really iron things out. I mean, today's equipment has shortened the learning curve, for sure. But at the same time, when you put the full package together of both casting and fishing, it does take time. And it depends on how much time you're spending on the water as well. as to how quickly, you can kind of absorb some of those new things. So yeah, I would say that that's probably a good thing to think about, coming away with a couple of really, key points that kind of changes how you look at it, or potentially changes, how you cast and fish.
Yeah, perfect. And Roger.bird.5 on Instagram, we had another question here. He was asking about kind of your gear. So I was just thinking about that as well, like on your gear. What is your, there's lots of great lines, lots of great rods. Is there a one you would recommend for this or that you use, or are you more SA, or what's your line of choice?
For the most part, I mean, I think there are a number of good rod manufacturers, and, rods in that, like I mentioned earlier, for most of this, 11 to 12 and a half feet in length really are probably match the best. I'm on the Scott Pro plan. So, I mean, I work with Scott, but I also work with Bob Meiser over, RB Meiser rods. He provides, a wide range of rods in that shorter length, some really good rods for the Great Lakes, and also, Echo has some less expensive options as well. So those are probably the three rod companies that, I kind of have associations with, and provide some, good equipment for this. I've been working with Simon Gawesworth and RIO the last number of years, and Simon did I was very honored for him to write the foreword for my new book.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I was pretty excited about that. And so I've been using, the RIO lines the last couple of years, and their Skagit lines, I think they've done a good job at, the early versions of Skagit lines were so heavy and clunky to me. They've done a really good job at kind of ironing out those tapers to a point where they feel pretty smooth when you're casting them. So they're not just fishing tools any longer. They make for a nice cast.
That's perfect. And the line thing is great because it's, it seems like they're all good, whether it's RIO or SA or, Airflow or you name it. So, they're all great. So that's what's cool about this. I always feel like I love hearing from, what the guides are using, just because I know it's just going to be a broad range. You go ask Geoff, and he's probably, you got a different, company he's using, and and it's all good. So what is the real? And I know we had Simon on. We'll put a link out to that episode recently. We were talking skeena fishing with Simon, but he was breaking down the RIO. What is the Skagit line you guys use for RIO? What's it called? Is it just the Skagit? I can't remember what it's called.
It's the Launch Max, I believe. There's two of them.
Okay.
Yeah, but that's the one I think I've been using.
Yeah. Okay. Good. And like I said, we'll get Simon. That's pretty cool on the forward thing. I mean, that's got to feel pretty good. Probably. I mean, maybe the biggest name in our current, in Spey. It seems like Simon's up there. What was that like? How did you convince him to do that?
Well, he's, and I just listened to, I was riding the other day and I listened to your podcast.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. It was, and that, that's just how he is. He's just really nice, genuine guy. And, when I approached him, he had no hesitation, in terms of, we had talked at the shows for years, and he knew who I was and all. And I had no hesitation in being interested in it. And when he read it, he was really excited about, the opportunity to do it. And, by his own words, I mean, he really feels that this was a book that was needed, something that was out there. There's been a lot of good books and videos on casting, but one that really kind of encapsulates everything from rigging to fishing to presentation and whatnot. I think he felt very strongly that, there was a niche there that this book fills. So it was great. It was an honor. I mean, really, it's an honor because his book, Spey casting, kind of really was a key part of my development. I think that came out in 2004, somewhere in the early 2000s. And just a really key part of, I think that's where things started to really click for me from a Spey casting standpoint, was after reading his book. So, for him to have that influence on me and then, provide that is just really full circle from that standpoint.
Yeah, that is amazing. And it seems like your book, when you just look at the Modern Spey, I mean, it seems like that it's just been out there for, you know what I mean? Like, it seems like it's just, when I first looked at it, I was like, oh, wow, do I already have this book? It already feels like, you know what I mean? Like, is that what you were going with the name? I mean, it's so simple on the naming as well, but you add modern, and it's like instantly you're like, oh, I know exactly, like, yeah, I need that book because there's a bunch of stuff in the last 20 years that have changed. I mean, that's what you're going for, right?
Right, it is. I'll say that I didn't want it to just be, the most current stuff, because there is more to spey fishing.
Yeah. Well, and what could it have been? Think of that. I'm sure you went through a few different names. Like, what would another name have been that wouldn't have been as good as this?
Yeah, I have struggled with titles on other books. This one was just seemed to be the only thing I could call it when I started writing it. And I think I did come up with the title with Jay Nichols, the publisher of it, or the editor. I think we came up with that title, while having dinner one night, and it's just never deviated. I just kind of felt like that, when I described what the idea of the book was and bringing kind of spey up to date. I mean, I think that title just popped out, and it never really deviated from it. But I think one of the key things about it, like I said, I don't want it to be, or didn't want it to be, and I don't think it turned out that way. Just talking about the last 5 years developments or things of that nature. There's actually an extensive chapter on the history of spey, and I felt like you really can't get a full flavor of what spey fishing is today without understanding where it came from and how it developed and why it developed in the past. And I think that was really an important aspect of it. And then I don't want to lose sight of the fact that styles of spey fishing that have been popular even for the last 20 or 30 years, that they're outdated. We still can use long rods and long lines. There's a place for those. And I wanted to make sure that, that was an integral part of the book as well, and understanding where to use those rods and where to use those lines. As a matter of fact, I'm going to salmon fishing next week up to Quebec. And, I plan to bring some 14 and a half footers, and get the longer lines out. That's the right place and time for those. And I don't want to lose that. So it's still a part of modern spey, even though we might think of modern spey as being more, Skagits and Scandies. Sure. And, I even have a section in there on bamboo. There's been advancements in bamboo, it's that kind of have gone into the modern era as well. So I didn't want to lose sight of that.
That's perfect. Are you heading up there with Topher?
I hope to see him. I know he's up there.
Yeah.
And actually, I just got a text from him last night, and it's been wet and cold up there. I saw the high temperature there. Today's only like 50 degrees, but I'm hoping that changes. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah, Topher broke down a good Atlantic salmon episode we had recently, so it was awesome to hear his story finally. Yeah. And so Modern Spey, so we've been talking about Modern Spey Fishing, the new book, but yeah, you've got a couple other ones. I mean, the one that I remember first from you was the Advanced Fly Fishing for Great Lake Steelhead. So, I mean, you've got, even though the new one isn't just steelhead, I mean, you've already got the other one that, kind of, wrote the book on, right? Talking about Great Lakes. So you got that. And then also you did some stuff, the hunting muskie with a fly in between there. And so, yeah, I mean, this is great. You're round out. Do you look ahead now? Are you kind of like thinking, okay, I've got to have, what's my next book? Are you already thinking about that or no?
I am. This one was really a lot of work, and particularly the last, half year of really putting it together really, really dragged me down. So I definitely need a break from books for a while. The one that I would really like to do, and I kind of have it mapped out a little bit in my mind, I'd like to do a trout book. It's really where I started fly fishing. It's something that I continue to do, inland trout or migratory trout. I continue to really enjoy, really all the different aspects of that. So I'd like to someday write a book on, kind of everything. It wouldn't be just a dry fly book, and it wouldn't be a streamer book. It would try to really, incorporate everything, that I've experienced, in the pursuit of trout.
Would it be everything around the country, the world, or would we focus more on Northeastern?
I think every experience I've had, and that would go outside of North America.
Today's episode is sponsored by Maverick Fly Fishing. They make the lightest Euro nymph reel in the world, which makes your rod more sensitive, casting more accurate, and you can hold your dead drifts longer without the shoulder burn. This reel is so unique you may not even recognize it as a fly reel. I had a chance to fish the stinger reel with Geoff on his home river on the Truckee. The biggest thing that I remember is the weight. The weight really stuck out because you can't even barely tell there's a reel. It's essentially kind of like you're holding a rod all day long. I mean, it's that light, and when you're Euro nymphing, that is a key. And the other big thing I remember from that day was catching a fish on my first cast. Pretty cool to be down in that part of the country and have some great success with Geoff. Maverick keeps things simple by offering a Euro nymph product line with essentials you'll need from rod, reel, fly line, and leader system. Euro nymphing doesn't have to be complicated, so let Maverick Fly Fishing get you started right now. You can learn more by checking out Maverick's YouTube channel for some tips and tutorials. And you can also head over right now to wetflyswing.com/Maverick to check out the good stuff they have going. That's Maverick, MAVRK, wetflyswing.com/Maverick to support this podcast and take a look at one of the most unique and efficient Euro nymphing setups on the market. Okay, back to the show. Good. Okay, so we got the book question answered. You're going to have some more good stuff coming. That's great. Talk about a little bit, you mentioned the history, and I don't want to lose that one. Give us the short little few-minute summary if you can, or just go into that a little bit on the history of Spey. Like we've talked about it a number of times, but give us from your perspective, how does that look? I know that's not an easy question, but just a quick little summary.
Yeah, I think, historically it started in the mid 1800s on the River Spey. That's where it received its name. I think the interesting part of that is that Spey casting developed more out of, the necessity or out of a way to solve a problem. And the problem was to make longer casts, longer fly casts in an area where there wasn't room for a back cast. And really, to make that change of direction with limited back cast room, the idea of making a, kind of a waterborne cast where the fly line does not go completely behind your casting position was how Spey casting was developed.
Did they ever at one point, it seems like, 15 foot, but it seems like that, why not go 25 feet? Like, was there ever that thing where there's some of those like even crazy longer rods?
Well, and that's what it was back in those days. They used these, and I just can't even imagine how heavy they were, but they were made out of a wood called greenheart. And some of those rods are 22, 23 feet long, so they're obviously beasts of rods. And, the one thing, I guess, if, you're trying to define what, might be modern Spey casting, the idea that, today we shoot, usually you strip off 40, 50 feet of running line, then shoot the head of the line. In original Spey casting, you use just the line that was beyond the tip of the rod. So you weren't shooting line. So I think that's really one of the key aspects of the longer rod is you're able to use a long head beyond the tip or a long length of line beyond that. I don't think they talked in terms of heads back then, but a long length of line beyond the tip. And it was able to make that cast. So, really through, the late 1800s, early 1900s, Spey casting was pretty much a European phenomena and was associated with Atlantic salmon. So it was certainly the birthplace. So it was probably more into the mid 1900s where Spey casting and Spey fishing started to show up in North America. First in the Atlantic salmon rivers, eventually then, through middle part of the maybe, somewhere in the middle 1900s, started showing up on the West Coast rivers, West Coast BC and things of that nature. Roderick Haig Brown talks about, using Spey casting, somewhere in the 50s and 60s on some of his rivers. So it started to slowly move. And I would say it probably really then took off, with the advent of fibercarver rods. And, when there's, I think in the late 1800s or late 1980s, or early 1990s, there was definitely that major expansion in Spey casting popularity, just because of the equipment.
That's it. So the equipment, so the rods came in, and now you had just really higher quality, whatever the modulus is of the graphite, right? That was it.
Yeah.
So they weren't these super heavy, what you hear about, these super heavy sticks back in the early 80s that were just night, and then whatever that line was, right?
Right.
And so it went from a great rod, and then you had the rod, and then then the lines came right behind with the Rio.
Exactly, because they originally on those longer rods that, that they were even fiberglass back, some of the original, U.S. made fiberglass rods, they were still being cast with like double taper. That was the Spey line back in those days, was a double taper line. Again, it was meant to be cast with the full line or the full length anyways beyond the tip. So I think that, if you really were to say what is modern Spey casting, modern Spey fishing, it's probably that advancement into the idea of shooting ahead of line and in using running lines, over just the length of the line beyond the tip.
Yeah, perfect. So that's the modern, and that's what you cover for the most part. Because on yours, do you get into any of because there's all sorts of different types of Spey. Like, we've had a couple episodes where people have been talking about casting off, into the salt right off of the bank and going for stripers or whatever. Is that part of something you talk about there, or would you consider that modern?
It is. Yeah, you have no question. Both in terms of using Spey casts in the salt and even though it's not truly Spey casting, overhead two-hand casting, for either saltwater. That's how I fish for muskies now for the last 5-6 years. It's just all overhead two-hand casting. And, it's really a very efficient way to cast those big fly. I mean, in muskie fishing, we're casting, 8, 10, 12-inch flies, very wind resistant, big bulky flies. And using a two-hander all day long is much easier than using a single-hander. And once you, kind of got used to, Spey casting and that forward Spey movement and using both hands and, pulling with the bottom hand and pushing with the top hand, you can develop some tremendous line speed easily as much or not more with, than the best double haul does on a single hand.
Oh, wow. Is that how you do it? Like, that's a good question. So if you're casting overhand with a two-handed rod, are you still doing the fulcrum and the pulling like you would with a Spey cast? Or are you doing, describe that, or is it more like a single-handed cast?
I think it's a little bit more of a hybrid because I am, instead of a full fulcrum, there's a little bit more movement of the top hand, kind of going forward, moving it in a longer path. But at the same time, the idea of pulling direct with the bottom hand really is what creates the line speed. It's very similar to a haul. So, it's slightly different than just the forward part of a Spey cast, but it has all the elements. So, I mean, if you are proficient at Spey casting and the forward Spey, you can pick up this overhead casting quite easily.
Nice. Maybe we'll touch on that when we see you there later this year. That'd be fun.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Touch base. So a couple other things. Well, first, let's just take it back on the water. We got a couple more quick questions here. And in one, let's just say we're fishing. We're on this run. We know there was some fish in there. We're swinging it down. And the question is how do you detect the strike? What does that look like? If it's swinging down, are these fish going to be hammering it? Are they going to be just tipping it? What do you do when you're sitting out there? How do you not miss a fish?
So I tend to be, and I talk about this extensively in the book about setting hook, because I think it is something that a lot of anglers really struggle with, especially if you're fairly new to swinging. I tend to be very passive with my hook setting, especially for steelhead. I don't want to react to just, a lot of times you get the little bumps and pulls while that fly's swinging. I don't want to react to that, because, the steelhead can kind of follow and, kind of pluck and pull at the fly. And at some point it might really grab it. Sometimes that happens through the swing. Sometimes it happens at the end of the swing. Other times they just won't grab it. But I feel like, I'm going to let that fly really just continue to swing until I feel the weight of the fish or actually feel, the pull of the fish. For the most part, when I'm steelhead fishing, there's a few exceptions to this, but for the most part, I'm using a click and pawl drag. I actually like this situation where I like the fish to actually take 4 or 5 clicks off the drag before I do anything. And usually by that time the fish is, I feel it's already hooked itself. But I'll let it take a few clicks off the drag and then, sweep to the near bank, and usually results in a pretty good hook set. Nick and I, we've had many, many discussions on this over the years. There are times, particularly in water that is colder, where the fish might not grab the fly and pull and might not turn, so where you just might feel the weight of the fish. And, there's times where if you don't react, I think that fish can pick up the fly and then drop it. So in those situations, there are times where, if you feel that's happening, particularly on like the hang down, and you feel the weight of the fish, but nothing happens, setting the hook, I think can, be a benefit in those situations. And a lot of times what we're doing to set the hook is, instead of, kind of doing a trout set or even a sweeping set, just kind of doing a pullback with the rod, almost like a strip set, but you're just pulling back the rod. So in that situation, if you do pull the fly and maybe it pulls it out of the fish's mouth, it didn't have it firmly, it's just going to pull it a little bit, and that might even trigger the fish to push up and take it.
I love that. Yeah, that trick, and I hadn't been doing it because that was one I think we did when we were with Geoff, at the end, so in the hang down, definitely let it hang down and then and I found myself doing that a lot. I'd give it like 2 or 3 or 4 pullbacks. Just it's one of those things you get in a zone, you know what I mean? So you're swinging and you're like, okay, it's kind of fun because at the end, you're at the hang down. It's kind of boring just to sit there and strip it in. It's kind of good to do something. And you're saying those fish are so active that's something that, whatever percentage, you're going to get some hookups from that.
Yeah. And a lot of times too, on that hang down, you'd give it 2 or 3 short strips too, even if you haven't felt the fish.
Short strips. Right.
Yeah. Short strips. But like you mentioned, just kind of doing that same thing, just doing the pullback 2 or 3 times, just to give the fly a little different look, a little different action. That can be effective. But yeah, in terms of setting the hook, really just, you don't want to be too quick, in my mind. And I think, okay, I probably miss a few grabs. There's probably times where a fish where what I'm feeling is just a fish plucking the fly where maybe it really had it in its mouth. But I think over the course of a day, a week, a year, being passive and kind of letting that fish really grab the fly and turn on it, I think overall it results in the most quality hookups. And, my landing ratio is, I think, very high because of that. So, for the few fish you might miss here and there, I think you make up for it, just in the total quality of the hookups that you get with that approach.
And you mentioned the click and pull. What's your reel? I'm not sure if you have a bunch of different reels, but what's your reel of choice for that?
I have a couple Farlex reels.
Oh yeah, the Farlex, yeah.
By Tim Jelinas in Seattle area. And I fished with him a few times. He really makes a high quality click drag. He's really passionate about his reels. They're easy to maintain, and they've performed very well for me.
Yeah, and then when you get a fish on with those, what's the secret to landing a fish if it gets a little hot on you? How does that work?
Yeah, just every now and then, you'll get a fish that, maybe is getting a little too close to some type of structure or something like that. So I can calm down the drag a little bit by just letting that line run through my index and middle finger, and just kind of add a little drag that way. There are a few situations, a couple rivers that I fish, and parts of the Niagara might be one of them, or is one of them, where you can't follow a fish real well, and it can get you into some areas that, where you're just going to really decrease your chances of a successful landing. So there are, times where I'll use a mechanical drag in those situations.
Gotcha. Okay. And let's leave, as we start to take it out here, I'm going to leave the last Instagram Q&A question. And I think you might know this person, but it's Spey_bum1 on Instagram. And he asked, the question he had was like about this desperate salmon story on the York River. So is this a good story to take us out of here today?
Sure, it is. It's a good story. So this is Brian Slavinsky. He's up there, and Brian is up on that river, same river right now.
Oh, okay.
This it goes back a long way. Actually, it's a story in. I wrote one book of stories called Reflections on the Water, and this is probably the most entertaining of the stories on that in that book. And yeah, it would probably take me an hour to go through the entire story, but I'll give you the abridged edition.
Yeah.
But we were up there, and certainly anytime. So I'll step it back a little bit. Brian has turned into one of the most ardent salmon fishermen that I know.
And we're talking Atlantic salmon?
Yeah, Atlantic salmon. He has probably Atlantic salmon fished up there every year since, I would say, about 1997. Maybe he's missed 1 or 2 years, and
Wow.
was in Norway last year. He probably missed a couple of years there during COVID, but has caught a lot of big fish, and he always blames me for giving him this addiction, because I took him up there on a trip in September of, I think, 97. So we were on a trip up there, and I would say 2004 maybe. And the fishing as usual was tough. I mean, we're pounding a fish out here and there. I think there was 4 of us, and maybe every day, every other day, one person in the group was getting a fish and just pounding it out. And I wanted to catch one on the York River, in kind of beautiful, intimate, Salmon River. And yeah, I just was, just kind of getting into that situation where I was just kind of feeling hopeless that I wasn't going to get one there. And there was a friend, his client of Brian's and friend, that was at our hotel, like, I don't know, maybe about 3 days before we were ready to leave. And he just sat back and took a draw of his cigar and drank a little scotch and said, I've never caught a desperate salmon. He says, anytime that, that I'm nearing the end of a trip and, it's kind of getting to that point where you're not sure you're going to get a fish. Yeah, you kind of start tightening up on the grip, and you just start fishing fast, and you just do things differently. And he says it just becomes, really almost impossible to get a fish when you're really in that desperation phase. So I remember when he first said that, that he's talking about, you can never catch a desperate salmon. I was like, what's he talking about? But then as he sat there and explained it all, it kind of started making a lot of sense. So that's all I could think about. I was in the desperation phase the last 2 to 3 days of the trip. I wanted to get one big salmon. And we fished this one pool, pretty popular pool that you got to walk down to. But we got there early, so we were the first ones on the water. And, the pool had fish in it. We were taking turns fishing the pool. Brian gave it to me first. And it was just kind of, giving me shouting. He was up high and he was shouting down, instructions as to how to cover all the fish. And I got through the pool once, and you kind of just cover it from this big rock. It's a falls pool, and you cover it just from this big rock, and you work down a little bit, but you can only work down the rock about, it's this big boulder. You can only work down it about 20 feet. So I go through it once, and it's like nothing, and, desperation sinking in. I think it might've been our last day. And all I could think about was the desperate salmon story. So so I make my last cast, and he goes, well, why don't you go through it one more time? So I make my last cast, and I got my fly just hanging in the water, right? My fly's still in the water. I start walking up to the top of the rock. And I go, oh, great. My fly's snagged now, because I just feel this like resistance.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, wait a second, I got a floating line on and an unweighted fly. And then all of a sudden it just dawns on me, the only thing it could possibly be is a fish. And as it turns out, it was this, almost 30-pound salmon.
No way.
It grabbed my fly while I was trolling it.
Wow. Right in, like, near the bank.
Yeah, trolling it on the way back up yeah, it was unbelievable.
Did you land it?
Yeah, it landed.
What was that fight like? What was the fight like?
Oh, it was unbelievable too, because of this pool, you can't follow.
Oh, right. You can't follow.
Yeah, because there was like a high cliff wall, and it was deep along the inside. So there's no way to follow. So it was just this tremendous it was a bright fish.
Did you have a click and pawl on that reel?
No, actually I did on that reel. I had a mechanical drag at the time. And I just remember the fish was at the lip of the pool, and I had just had to hold on to it because I knew if it got out of the pool, it's gone. And so something was either going to break or I was going to turn the fish. And it was just that feeling. I think we probably have, if you fish and roost fish enough, you have that feeling where it just, you're right at the brink and all of a sudden you could just kind of feel the fish starting to relent.
There you go. That's awesome. I'm glad. And who was that again that mentioned that?
That's Brian Slavinsky.
Yeah, that's all. I'm glad and we chatted a little bit on Instagram as well. So that's great. And where is the York River?
It's way at the very end of the Gaspé Peninsula, out near the town of Gaspé. Beautiful, just a beautiful river. It's just smaller, more intimate. I kind of always thought about it as being almost the counterpart to like the Kispiox up in BC. Just a smaller, intimate piece of water that has big fish.
Right, Gaspé, that's it. And that's always the question. I think I might have talked to Topher about that. We were talking Atlantic salmon versus steelhead. You've done a little of both. What's your feeling for, I guess the thing is it's easier to find steelhead in the lower 48, but I mean, when you think about the fish you've hooked Atlantic salmon versus steelhead, what's the big difference there?
I think the biggest difference from at least the rivers I have fished, the biggest difference from a fishing standpoint is where fish lie. It seems like salmon take up more specific lies, where I feel like when I fish steelhead water, they can be in just a much wider range of different areas. So I think that's the thing to me, kind of understanding where to find fish in salmon fishing. And again, this is just based on my own experience versus in steelhead where, I just feel more comfortable covering just almost everything, when it comes to steelhead. That's a little bit of a reach, but covering a wider range of water.
Yeah, you're not going to be, and again, I'm not in the Atlantic salmon range as much, but I mean, my guess is there's not many people nymphing for Atlantic salmon.
Right. And that quite honestly is a difference too, in that generally you want a little more speed in the fly when you're swinging it for salmon to kind of get that triggering. A little more, I would say. There's a lot of summer steelhead areas where the fish are surface oriented, but probably an Atlantic salmon are a little more surface oriented too.
Yeah, perfect. Let's take it out here just with the flies. I was thinking of Nick, we did a great episode where we talked about his fly tying. Obviously he's pounding out a bunch of patterns. What's your one fly? Let's say on this trip. So we're starting out day one. We're out there on, early December, typically what's that fly you might be putting on there?
I've relied heavily on just some pretty simple marabou patterns, but, just some reverse tie marabous, black over purple.
And what's the reverse tie?
So actually, if anybody's interested in seeing that, I do have I got a few YouTube videos up there, and I do have, it's just Rick Kustich fly fishing. There's a video on that. So basically you're tying it on a tube. You start basically tying it backwards. You wind the first hackle of marabou, at the back, what would look like the back, and then you flip the tube around so it's the front. But what it does is, it just really helps it to stay upright and creates a lot more bulk in the water. So that's the biggest advantage of it. And it really creates a lot of movement too, because it doesn't mat down. So it really allows the fingers and the fibers of the marabou to work real well in the water. That's one of my go-tos. And then, a couple other patterns that I like, the one that I've relied on a lot is the bunny spey. Just kind of a combination of rabbit and spey hackle. You can pretty much find that in any of my books. I've talked about that one. And then there's one that it's pretty simple. I either tie it in a tube or on a shank, and it's just called a catitude. And it just combines marabou or Arctic fox underwing with ostrich and hackle, saddle hackle and some flash. So it's just kind of a longer wing and really gets a lot of movement in the water. So those are my go-tos.
We'll put links out to your video in the show notes as well and some of those flies. And then what would be, we'll just talk for Nick since he's not here. What would be his steelhead fly if we're out there with him? What do you think he's putting on there?
He's really gives it a lot of thought. He's a tremendous tyer. He's really one of the top production tyers in the country. I think one that he likes is Bill's Spey, and it's a little bit more of a natural look, a lot of movement in the water. Or the turducken.
The turd, what is it? The turducken?
The turducken. Turkey, chicken, and
gotcha.
And duck in it. So yeah, it's one of his go-to patterns as well.
That's it. And Bill do you know Bill, is there a name there, or is that just
Bill is his father, so it's named after his dad. And materials that it's kind of, the original one was tied from some materials, all that his dad grew different, had different birds on his property. So it kind of comes from that.
Nice. All right, Rick. Well, I think we'll leave it there, and we'll send everybody, like we said, rickkustich.com or on Instagram, and we'll send people out. We'll put a link again, to connect with your book. Take a look there. But yeah, thanks for all the time today. It's been good to, get caught up and get fired up for this trip later this year. So I'm excited about that, and we'll be seeing you on the water.
Oh, that sounds great, Dave. Always a pleasure talking with you, and I look forward to seeing you later this year.
There we go. You can head over to wetflyswing.com/476 right now. You can check in right there, 476, and get the show notes and get some other bonuses we have there at the website. A quick shout out before we get out of here to you. And if you are loving this show, loving this episode, or loving any past episodes, if you can share an episode this week, that would help us tremendously and help another fellow angler out there maybe that doesn't know the show exists to get a little bonus this week. I always love when I get a heads up on a new podcast and I can go over there and binge it. Just binge the episode and listen to like a full day or whatever a week. We love it when people are able to do that in the back catalog. Let's see, do we have a random fun fact as I leave you out of here? I'm going to be thinking, as I'm thinking Steelhead School, we're thinking Steelhead Alley, of course. And let's take a look at where we're heading next. Okay, after we wrap up Steelhead Week this year, just looking ahead next week, we are going to be heading to the St. Joe River. We've got River Horse coming on, and we have the GLD number 4, Great Lakes Dude podcast number 4 is coming out next week, and I believe this is going to be the first interview that Geoff does on this podcast. So stay tuned for that. We got a big week coming next week, and actually this Friday and Wednesday, we've got 2 big episodes coming up here this week as well. So if you want to hear Geoff Schaake dig into Steelhead Alley, we're going to be digging into that again on Wednesday. And then we've got the Fly Fishers International coming in at the end of the week to wrap us out of here. Okay, I'm going to let you get off to it and check in with Steelhead Week as we get this kicking off just now. Definitely, if you're interested in this, you can do it right now. wetflyswing.com/Steelhead School. You can save a spot. We do have limited numbers of spots this year, so if you really want to get on this, get the double whammy, get a chance to check out our second year of the Steelhead School East. And if you're interested in fishing Lake Erie trips, either New York or Ohio, we've got you covered. Hope to see you on the water. And if I don't, catch me online if you can. And I hope you are having a great evening, great morning, or great afternoon wherever you are in the world. And you are amazing for stopping in today and listening all the way to the very end of the show. See ya.
Thanks for listening to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show. For notes and links from this episode, visit wetflyswing.com.